It's amazing.
Red light.
Yeah, there you go.
Just a little diversion for a few minutes and talk about strategic planning, given the lack of show of hands on that issue. One thing to start, Barbados has a strategic plan. Maybe I missed your hand there. You do have it.
Yeah.
You did it at the front end of the master plan, but it was a real strategic plan. The other thing is, ACI has a lot to offer in terms of strategic plans. Kevin, you want to talk about the different courses you have that could include strategic, including the new online one that's coming on?
Yeah, we do offer, of course, for those of you familiar, there are a few graduates in here, maybe Robert can pipe in too, because he's an instructor in that. The Joint ICAO-ACI Airport Management and Professional Accreditation Program. So the Gateway course, which is their transport systems, covers pretty in detail the strategic planning process, including actually development of one presentation on the last year course with a very hard panel of judges. We do offer, obviously, some of the new online course, it's the Airport Operations Diploma Program, sort of a level down, more of a supervisory level course, but still understanding the concepts, line of strategic plan. There's a big issue some airports have, and we'll talk to this, is really getting everybody involved in a strategic plan, because your line staff might say, you know what, that's your strategic plan, that's not ours. So we sort of cover some aspects to that. And something also to tie into that, a component of the strategic plan, we offer courses on master planning, just so the airports would form clients. A lot of times that's outsourced to consultants. But as our members are really, the airports should be knowledgeable as far as what's actually going to be done with the master plan. And Robert, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that?
Well, thank you, Kevin. I'm a zealot for strategic plans. I've seen it around the world where it works well. Because your goal is to create a high-performance airport. And it is the first leg of your stool in doing that. And it drives your operational plans that I talked about earlier, your budgeting, and then your performance reporting. When you get this right, your airport becomes more agile, you're more efficient, you're more effective. So take a little time. If you don't have one, then get your senior management. There are tons of books, as Kevin talked about. There are lots of instructions from ACI and others that help you out there, and make it the foundation for your decisions. You will find that once you get it, you implement it, and you do it, it will cost you less. You will make better decisions quicker. And I'm a strong proponent of the advantages, because there are a number of airports around the world where it works well, and you push the decisions to the people ideally closest to your customers. So managers and so forth don't have to make a lot of decisions. You make the strategic decision making at your level. So that's all I'll say about it. I'll try to keep quiet, Gordon. I get through this.
Well, since this is more or less a little sidetrack, and I don't want to take a lot of time and teach strategic plans, especially if somebody's sitting here that teaches strategic plans. That's a bit scary. But the key elements are these. And to me, and not everybody would agree with this that does strategic planning, I find the process really important, because you do involve everybody. And in a simplistic way, what you end up with is everybody singing from the same song sheet, that people understand collectively what the airport's about. So the mission statement to me, and I'll oversimplify it, you can just jump in, but mission is simply, who are we? Who are we today? The vision is who we want to be tomorrow. Where are we? Where do we want this airport to be? And when I talked about transparency in the early session, we talked about getting carriers and staff and everybody involved in some of these decisions. This is important, because a vision statement that is unrealistic is not a vision statement. It's just a wasting your precious time. And you need that reality check. If you have a small island in the south of the Caribbean to define yourself as your vision is you're going to be the world hub of aviation. It's just, it's ridiculous. You need to have something that has a common sense element to it. You like to dream, but the dream has to have an element of reality. The third part of it is SWOTs. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And this is where you involve people in looking at those elements of the airport. What are we good at? What facilities do we have that are unique? What capabilities do we have? What physical location are we in the world or in our region that gives us an edge? Weaknesses, what are we missing? Opportunities, what's on the horizon that would make us more able to achieve our vision? And threats are what's going to impede us in meeting our vision. I mean, what are our competing airports doing that might threaten our future? Goals start to come down to more immediate things and more defined. Let me give you an example, and Robert might come up with better ones, but I would say, a goal might be to have nonstop service to Frankfurt by 2016 is a goal to me. Now, it's a very narrow one. Some airports might define them a bit broader. And the last step to me is actions, and that is who's going to do it, how are we going to get there, and how long do we have? So if I followed that little example of the non-stop service to Frankfurt, then the action to me would be that the air service unit in the airport will have the marketing package developed for the Frankfurt service by the end of fiscal year 2013, that kind of thing. Now everybody, there's different variations, and you might do it a bit differently, but the idea is generally collectively to figure out what you're good at, what you're not good at, where you want to go, and you drive everything from that. So if you remember that early slide I put up, your master plan, your marketing plan, your business plan, everything flows from this. And it all should make sense. When it's all done, it shouldn't be incongruous that, there's a disconnect. Robert mentioned, just as we were breaking up to the group, he mentioned, somebody starting with their master plan to drive other things. Well, the problem with that is that has the potential of becoming the build it and they will come kind of approach. Because they've only got these facilities, therefore, we're going to head in this direction. It's the wrong way of going. I'm going to go back to my somewhat original program. We were missing some speakers. And I decided then, because I had Christine still here and Robert still here, I decided to jump to my session 9 instead of 8 because it talks about airport charges, first half, and then incentive schemes. There's almost two distinct halves to this session. I want to talk about airport charges, and I have a bit of a different perspective than I would say the generalized philosophy that airport charges don't add up to very much. I have some disagreement with that because I always think of the direct passenger charges, they're kind of like airport charges. I know where the revenue ends up. And the other thing is, I'm going to talk about it, it's not strictly speaking an airport charge. It's all these government fees that are being loaded onto airports and onto the passengers. And the reason I want to bring those in is because they do affect your business. I'll take you and show you what some of them do. We'll talk about elasticity of demand. There's no free lunch. If the government decides to bail itself in for a $20 security fee, it will affect your traffic. If you're in a leisure market, which most of you are, traffic is quite sensitive to that kind of thing. And we've got some numbers that I'll show you. So let me start off with the airport charges. I'll look at briefly the traditional ones you all know. I'm going to talk about some new ones, and then I really want to talk about the impact. I'm not going to talk about this. You all know them. We've got this whole array of charges, and from Christine's perspective, of course, they all end up someplace in the carrier budget. But I want to talk about what I call new. Now, they're not all totally new, but there's this pattern developing that is really strange. We spent all day yesterday talking about the importance of aviation to business and how critical aviation was to the development of this city. And then we've got governments that are treating aviation like it's a luxury. Oh, well, let's put a luxury tax on aviation. You know, it's a little hard to understand when the word business drives off of aviation, how it can be a luxury. So, you know, the European Parliament, and we've heard these numbers from other people, you know, airport charges, they're not very big in the scale of things, 4%, 8%, but a few things in those numbers. I mean, they're typically not including the direct passenger charges, what I call the airport improvement fee or PFCs. And then they're not counting these other governmental kind of charges that are loaded onto the ticket. They're all important. And where they get really important, and I'll show you some numbers, but the short-haul flights and low-cost carriers, I mean, it's a big, big deal. This environmental charge thing started off, it's primarily in Europe. I don't know if any of you, these are the ones I know of. There may be other ones, but they've got noise charges at a number of airports. Sometimes they can be aircraft type specific or whatever, but they exist quite a bit of places. They've got emission charges at airports, and you see the pattern. I mean, they started quite a ways back, but there's a growing pattern through the last decade of these kind of charges coming into place. And these are the ones that really rub me the wrong way. These luxury taxes are beauties. I mean, they are put on, and sometimes they're put towards aviation, sometimes they're just put against general income of the country. I wrote this slide, but I was laughing when I read it this morning, and I said poorer countries, and then I used France as an example. I'll have to change the wording of that. Luckily, there's nobody here from France. Some of them are not put towards aviation or tourism at all. The UK one, which we'll expand on in a minute, is probably the worst example. And often, these have been disguised as environmental. But I mean, I think everybody in our industry knows that they're not so much environmental, they're about revenue for governments. Okay. This is the US APD. This is what I call the luxury tax. I mean, look at the scale of these charges. These are very, very significant. I'll show you a specific example of what it does in the Caribbean in a few minutes. But it's a big, big numbers. Imagine you're taking a family of 4 somewhere on a vacation in the Caribbean from London. You've got 4 times 80, 320 pounds of $450, $500 up. Just luxury tax fees on top of your ticket price. So as I mentioned, and it wouldn't be a surprise to anybody, huge differences between carriers. I mean, the carriers that are flying primarily long-haul routes and with a mix of business and leisure passengers and business class seats and so on, the fees end up being a relatively small amount of the total airline cost structure. But as you get into shorter haul carriers, they get progressively larger. You know, this is you know, it's a little dated here, 2009, but this is an airline financial statement out of a low-cost carrier in Europe. And look at these numbers. The airport charges are about 20% of the total airline costs, and the handling charges are another 10%. So though at that point, I mean, fuel's went up since then, I think, but at that point, the airport charges and the handling charges were about the same amount, about 30% as fuel together. That's quite a different perspective than what we're normally used to, that airport charges aren't very much. But this is, again, it's a low-cost, short-haul, point-to-point carrier. And this is really why I want to talk about it. I think intuitively, everybody knows this. But, you know, an economist will simply say, you know, demand for a product depends on how much you have to pay for it. It's pretty common sense. I take it one step further and say, let's be careful to say we're not looking at fares, we're looking at price. And price is fares plus taxes. That's what the passenger sees when he makes his decision. Can I afford to take the family to St. Lucia this winter? That's what he's looking at. Okay? And he's not looking at it first off because it'll be hidden, but when he goes to buy the tickets, that's what he'll see. These are the kind of price elasticities that we figured out from a bunch of different sources. But you know, if you start with long-haul international business, it's not very elastic. And by elasticity, we say the percent change in demand as a function of the percent change in price. So if I look at, for example, international long-haul business travel, a 1% increase in price will typically lead to a 0.3% decrease in traffic. So 10% increase in price will still lead to a 3% decrease in traffic, which is meaningful. 3% is not trivial. But as we go down progressively towards short-haul leisure, we start getting into really risky areas in that the elasticity is more than 1. So a 10% increase in price will lead to a 15% decrease in travel demand. It's pretty substantial. So let me go back and look at that example that I thought I said I would mention in Barbados. So I just looked up last week a discounted fare on a scheduled mainline carrier. I just went on one of the websites and picked it off. So there are cheaper fares out there, I'm sure, with charters and so on. I would think probably there's actually a few people paying $1,000 London Barbados. But that luxury tax is $128 because Barbados is it's 200 miles over, nautical miles over that 4,000 nautical mile threshold. So, yeah, toe the island just a little bit. Yeah. So look at the tax impact on the fare. That's almost a 13% bump in the cost of that ticket. It's almost a purely leisure market, so we would expect travel demand to be decreased by more than 12%. And that's pretty much what's been going on. It's hard to pick it out because we've got this recession, but traffic, Jason, you said traffic's down about 6%.
Yes.
You know, so because they're heavy from the UK.
That's only the UK part of the tax
Yeah.
revenue. What is the Barbados part of New Zealand?
Yeah.
It just shows you the impact of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So all of this to say, there's a cost to pay for these add-on fees and charges. And we all need, like everything we can possibly control as airport managers and everything we can possibly influence with our government is to say, be very, very careful what you're doing. Because I'm sure Christine could get up and say, on a lot of routes, if I lose 12% of the passengers, that route's gone. If I lose 5% of the passengers, the route's gone. That threshold between profitability and loss is pretty thin. So before we move on to looking at another subject here, just to wrap up this fees and charges, I mean, please, when you're thinking about this, look at the total picture. Don't live and die with this 4% thing. Look at the total picture that you're seeing at your airport. What are all the fees and charges that are being loaded on the ticket? Be sensitive to this elasticity issue and absolutely do what you can to manage those fees and charges and work with your governments to make sure they understand the consequences of what they're doing. If I worked in an economy that's heavily dependent on tourism, I'd want to be really careful with these kind of numbers. Okay, and before we leave and move on to incentive schemes, any discussion, questions, issues? I think, Christine, you mentioned you're seeing patterns of more fees being loaded on some of the islands.
Yes, we definitely are. They support tourism. There's a tourism tax. There's any number of things you can call it. But you just add it. I mean, it flows right through to the customer.
Yeah. Any other discussion, questions, speaking with other?
Gordon, I don't disagree with your premise of that. I disagree with lumping government fees into airport fees. Because an airport manager's job is to keep the fees as low as they can be, as efficient, and as you said, should lobby the government. So if you amalgamate it in with the airport fees, the government says, oh, you know, it's not something I have to, if you segregate it and put the spotlight on it, then I think it makes a difference.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, I'm grouping them together because I wanted to show the big picture, but you're right in terms of presenting them.
Because an airport manager and rate-making methodology gets into airport fees, but an airport manager can do the best job that they can. And the government administrator says, and I told you about an experience I had in the Caribbean last year, comes in and says, we're going to add $20 on it. And the airport manager has worked as hard as they can. So I think segregating those puts the spotlight on where the attention needs to be.
Unfortunately, the consumer just sees one big fact.
Yeah.
They see it as the whole country. They don't differentiate between the airport and the tax and the tourism tax.
Well, they blame the airline. They say the airline.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yes, tickets are actually taxes.
But the government's got to understand what they're doing.
Yeah,
Because there
that's-
is a tipping point. That's why. And a beach in Barbados is like a beach in St. Louis, the St. Lucia.
That's
And when you're
good.
talking about $300 difference,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
hey, I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or
That's-
Florida.
Let me switch gears then and talk about incentive schemes. Now, most of the data I have here is about Europe because it tends to have been on the cutting edge. I will speak a bit more about this afternoon, but because they've had low-cost carriers, and I call them extreme low-cost carriers, the Ryanair model is just kind of unique. But they had a lot of pressure to bring in incentive schemes, and they do get some unique results from it. There's some strange stuff goes on in Europe that's caused by super low fares. When I was working in Krakow last year, and EasyJet and Ryanair come and go, and they were Ryanair, I think it was Ryanair, or EasyJet was boarding a flight from Krakow to Sicily. It's like a daily scheduled flight from Krakow to Sicily. How can this work? Well, it works because the fare is like $50. And then there's all kinds of, surcharges, and you can't carry any luggage except what's in your pocket. They created a market, and I'll show you some of that this afternoon, where whole markets are created. In that case, incentive schemes start to take on a bit of a different meaning for the airport because markets are being created that are generating a lot of travel that wasn't there before. So they start to make some kind of sense. Okay, so I want to talk you through about incentives, looking at simplistically why, what, how much, and what are the issues. I mean, the whole purpose of incentives is to try to encourage new services, new frequencies, whatever, from a carrier by sharing risk with them in some way and to promote the destination. In the European model, there's this issue of try to attract traffic to a secondary airport. The weirdest one is Hahn, Germany, because Ryanair goes in there and EU actually took them on because they were calling it Frankfurt. And it's like, that was at 80 kilometers, I think. It's way ways out of town. But they called it a Frankfurt destination because it was a cheap airport to operate from. Okay. Yesterday, one of the speakers, there was some numbers on the economic impact. I have a bit of a different, they're not necessarily contradictory, they're just looked at a different way. But from a study that Vancouver Airport did some years back, said a daily 747 service will create 314 jobs basically at and around associated with the airport. Not the broader community, just direct, indirect stuff that's related to that flight. Obviously, as the aircraft gets smaller, that impact is also smaller. Okay. So when we talk about airport incentives, I mean, the range is really quite large. What most people are looking at, what they're mostly talking about, are some kind of aeronautical charge reduction and some kind of marketing support, or a combination of those. As we go progressively deeper, we get into the revenue guarantees, we get into risk sharing, and on the extreme models, there's even some kind of joint venture type stuff. And there's all these little add-ons at the end as well. So let's talk a bit about that. They're typically, I mean, they're somehow, you put an incentive scheme because you want the carrier to do a certain thing. So you're going to say, if you bring in this size aircraft or this many passengers, you could work on the metrics with the carrier, but you're going to gear them to some performance on the route. You're looking at gearing it to specific type of service. You're saying, if you start this new service or new frequency, this is what we'll do. And the 3 years is pretty common. I'll show you in Europe anyway, a bunch of examples from different airports. Usually a phased approach. You know, the first couple of months there's no charges, and then there's some, and then there's more. And at the end of 3 years, they're back to a full charging program. The flexibility, of course, you're the one writing the incentive program for your airport. You can make it any way you want. If you want to have incentives for people to operate in off-peak times, you can try that. Whether it'll work or not is a different story. You might be able to create a huge incentive for a new base carrier. I'll show you an example of that one. But, you know, with all that range of possibilities, including guarantees and so on, really, again, this is European data. Most of what is offered is direct reduction of fees and charges for new destinations and extra frequencies and so on, and marketing support. I mean, that's basically what most people were talking about. So the fee discounts, as I mentioned, are typically slid in over a 3-year period, and they're usually offered for, I mean, basically it's new services or new frequencies. So let me show you some examples. This one's nice. This is Krakow. This is really nice and clean. It's just very clear cut. You know, first, if you're running twice a week, for the first 3 months, it's 100% discount, and then the rest of that year, it's 30%. Then there's a 20% discount in the second year, 10% in the third year, and it's gone. It's a nice clear cut, and it varies by frequency. But, you know, if I look at all around the European markets, they're all similar. This is Athens, and it's got, this one is free landing and parking for the first 3 years, and it goes on in the 4th and 5th year as well. So that's a longer one than normal. You have this on a handout, I think, don't you? Yeah. So I won't take you through all the grim details, but you'll see a lot of the airports in Europe have these schemes in place, and they're all kind of similar. They're, you know, big discount first year, and then shrinking. This is Nice, same kind of thing, 75% for year 1, and then shrinking to 50% in year 2. Okay. Marketing support is the one, I think it's the one that nobody has a problem with. We just need, as airport people, need to make sure we have some money, because it is important. Steve mentioned that this morning. This is the one area where it seems completely reasonable from both the airline and airport perspective that the airport would contribute at the front end to marketing these services. And it's important to get the service started. And as I mentioned in some of the discussion, I mean, look at both ends of the route. You've got to market. Both ends of the route have to be sold. This was Krakow's, what they are prepared to contribute to marketing. And again, you know, they've been very explicit in their table. They're just saying, well, if you run a new market with a 200-seat airplane, I'm going to give you 80,000 euros, or we're going to contribute 80,000 euros to a marketing campaign. So Revenue guarantees, now, I don't know, the only places I know that have done revenue schemes, and I guarantee these are small community stuff. I don't, do you know some larger places that have done revenue guarantees? The one, I know Denver put up $1 million looking for Lufthansa at some point. Do you have any examples or larger airports that you could? Not that you can discuss. The only ones I've had personal interaction with are just like the small communities that are trying to either get or maintain services and are provided. It's more like a guaranteed service guarantee to try and keep service in the community. But the risk is it can be quite expensive. And as you'll see in one of my final slides, I mean, basically, if you set up that scheme, consider the money gone. I want to give you an extreme example, and it's not applicable to many airports, but it's a really cool example. Toronto City Centre Airport. When we went in there, there's 20,000 passengers. And it sat there for years at that kind of number. It's right downtown in Toronto. So we worked to get a base carrier. Got a new carrier startup, base carrier. And there was a lot of incentives offered. We allowed them to build their own terminal. We protected them from predation from the mainline carrier for 3 years. We did that uniquely by there was a noise budget, and we gave all the noise budget to the new carrier, basically. It was deliberate. We had to protect. We understand how the market works. We know what would have happened if we hadn't done that, because the mainline carrier would have come in with predatory pricing and driven them out of business. So, but here's the flip side. The airport put a lot of investment in this and so on, and there's a lot of incentives provided by the airport. But the flip side is the airport got a revenue guarantee, a deficiency agreement it's called, including profit for the Port Authority. Growth started off, in 4 years, went from 20,000 to 2 million passengers. And the Port Authority went from a loss position to a profitable position. So regardless of the scale of that incentive scheme, it all made good business sense to the Port Authority. You know, this is the tough part about incentives, is trying to ask yourself as airports, are they really needed, or am I just being played here? Are they valuable? Are they simple, and are they transparent? I want to talk about the valuable thing for a second. And Christine and others might have somewhat different numbers, but what we did is we said, let's look at different aircraft and look at the average block hour cost and their average block time, and say, what is a flight worth? And then over a year, what would that mean? And if I use that, and it's all from memory at this point because it's some time ago, but I think Denver put up $1 million for Lufthansa service. Well, the value, the cost of that service in a year is about $92 million. So that $1 million was like a 1% contribution. You have to ask yourself, is that meaningful? Would that have possibly made the difference? It seems really small to me. But the flip side of this, if you get into the short haul kind of services, the numbers aren't as big, and the incentive might be meaningful, could make the difference between whether that flight exists or not. So, are the airlines taking the incentive money that's available, or is it going to make the difference? And I don't know the answer to that. I just know, particularly in the European situation, airports are being played off and one against the other. So, just to summarize on incentives, from our recommendation would be you keep them in a contained time frame, focus on this marketing and startup, help them get through that risk period, and that seems like a legitimate process to me. Be very wary of revenue guarantees. You'll spend it all, very likely. and attempt to share the risk. And in the deal, in your incentive scheme, keep the performance metrics simple. If you're offering for a certain level of passenger traffic discounts or a certain size of aircraft and frequency, keep it pretty simple, because you're going to have to measure it and agree with the carrier that they have achieved it or not. So a couple of other things on incentives, though. Keep it fair. We talked about this in the earlier session. The really dangerous kind of stuff that's happened in some places in Europe is differential incentives, special incentives for one kind of carrier or one carrier. So it needs to be fair. It needs to be offered to everybody, and we need to keep it reasonably short.
I find that, and I'm speaking for the travel markets on this, that tourism is a backbone of the country. And so the need is on our side more than the airline to get there. Incentive, the best incentive package, is neither here nor there for the real big flyers. I don't know. The negotiation is skewed. It's already skewed to start out against the small carriage companies, trying to boost its tourism to keep the country afloat, because half of the time tourism is what carries the country. So I don't know, how do we angle it? How do we posture against these mega airlines? Because some of these airlines probably, making more than the country GNP.
I'm
How
smiling.
do we even start a negotiation?
I'm smiling when you talked about this skewed relationship, because I think the airlines have been relatively gentle with the islands compared to the cruise ships. You were going to say something?
You're right. It comes down to, we've got to find a way to make money, and you have a lot more to lose than we do.
Exactly.
And I'm not sure what the answer is for that. The revenue guarantee, and I can only speak for the way we handle ours, it's very one-sided. It's my favorite. That's the reality. Because if you don't have a revenue guarantee in some places, in the places where we look for that support, I'm not flying without it. So if you cannot participate in that kind of agreement, then I would like to find someplace else to use my aircraft.
And
that's not every example,
Yeah.
but that's the extreme. But from an expectation perspective, I go into a new market expecting marketing support. That's the positive admission.
Yeah, that's a given.
But
The
the
more-
revenue guarantee is very tricky.
Revenue guarantees, they're not in your optimum perfect world, but length, what's typical? How long are you seeing them?
My vision of a revenue guarantee is to help me get that service off the ground in year one. If it's going beyond year, and this is the Caribbean and Latin America. I know in Europe they have longer agreements. I think in Europe they're 3 years. But for something in the Caribbean, I expect the market to work on its own after the end of the year. Because if we're going to 2 years and 3 years and 4 years, well, then it's a subsidy.
Yeah.
Then I'm flying, and there's not really enough demand, but because you're helping to support it, then I'll keep flying. Is that really what you want to do?
Is that a healthy relationship?
Exactly. And it is very expensive. Now, I've had revenue guarantees where the people who guaranteed it didn't end up paying a dime. They're very rare. And I will tell, when we started service to Liberia, Costa Rica, which was back in 2008, there was no other carrier service, and they signed up for $3.4 million revenue guarantee, and that was 1 year. They ended up paying less than $300,000, which from their perspective was a huge win and well worth it. But that's the exception, not the rule.
The one thing we can do is, when they come to us, take really good care of them, make sure they want to keep coming back, the tourists. Sometimes you find that we're all engaged in the business of getting the airlines there, getting the tourists into the country, and the rest of the country is disinterested, or they see them as a nuisance. They don't realize what it's come, because we've gone flip on that. We depended on, we had a good return customer service, and the banking industry took off. So that drew a lot of tourists, that drew a lot of people traveling there. And now we've got a system came out. Now we have a new focus. We have a program out in Cayman Islands. We have a better focus on taking care of the tourists.
All the tourists that feeds it.
Make their stay more enjoyable.
You've tripped me into one of my favorite hotbed subjects, and that's government services at these airports, because I just can't get my mind around the idea that the tourism is really important, but immigration and customs doesn't bother to staff properly, and they delay people coming and going, and huge lineups even on departure, which is the last experience people have with the island, is they're lined up to go through outbound immigration, and they're hot. And it's just like, why is it difficult for the government to understand this is not the right way to go? What's that? Sorry.
I said one of the problems that I see in every country, the big ones and the small ones, the ones that depend on tourism solely as their main source of as an economic force. But just going back even to the question that was asked before from my colleague from Jamaica, part of it also in terms of us starting the negotiations already being on the back foot is in terms of what we expect the airlines to do, and it goes back to what you just brought up in terms of the government. There's some destinations that no matter what, even with the market support or the guaranteed seats, whatever it is, an airline coming in 7 days a week, you're not going to get those numbers. But because of the politics of everything, an airline coming in 7 days a week and you see that on the tarmac is important to the said government. So you're willing to put that out there no matter what. And I think part of it is simply that some of us have to learn to live within our own means. Listen, we have these many rules. We can fill this many. You know what? Let's say coming out of Canada, the US, or UK, what we can get in terms of what our market is there and so on. And that there's no way a flight daily is going to make any sense unless you're willing, as Christine just said, unless you're willing just to say, okay, I'm just subsidizing to make sure that we see that on the apron every day to say, look at what we do. This is the case.
That brings up something interesting I want to ask Christine. I was working on a project with Egypt Air, and the route specialist from the consulting team that was there was basically trying to. They had a number of long-haul routes where they were running once a week and twice a week, and his perspective was, if you can't sustain 3 times a week, you shouldn't be on the route. I don't know what's Delta's kind of perspective, or your.
It depends on the market. Yes. It depends on the market. I have a number of trading stations that we serve Saturday only, and it works. Yeah, it works from a profitability perspective, and it works because it's an easy way for me to get an aircraft time. I can cancel a business market on Saturday, and I can allocate that aircraft to a leisure market, and it works.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, seasonal as well.
Yeah.
Cancel a lot of the fall. But it depends on the dynamics of the market. If there's a business component to that market, then once a week absolutely does not work. Then you need at least 4.
I think also a lot of it depends on the airline and the way the airline does business in terms of what their focus is. For example, Virgin has just changed their focus, meaning a lot coming out of work into the Caribbean. They said they're looking at next year a lot more the high end. Before that was in Virgin. We spoke to Virgin before. Virgin was more looking to fill the back of the plane. That is where. Now they've said that they're changing that to go to the high. Where the immediate competition, BA, which was always so much focused on the business aspect, is now more looking at the leisure. So it's, and I just to back up part of what Christine said earlier, I think One, I think the Roots Conference is a great conference. It's one of the best I've ever been to in terms of actually getting business done and making that connection. And I think the part about the relationship is very important, that you have to get to know these people and really build that. And from our perspective, understand that basically the airlines are there to make money also. They're not going to say, we love St. Vincent's and the Grenadines so much, I'm going to give you 4 francs because we know. So it's not
Sometimes it's also collaboration with the airlines themselves. Like, for example, in Jamaica, we had Virgin and BA in both Kingston and Montego Bay. They weren't profitable. It's the same, one set of people going and then it's shared between both airlines. So what they did is they decided, and it's more expensive for both of them to be in both cities. So what they did is BA is now flying from Kingston, Virgin from Montego Bay. So that
Wow, so they colluded.
It was
I'm laughing because if you talk like that in the US, people would be going to jail.
Kingston also is the business center. BA is more focused on business market. Virgin is the letter Montego Bay. So it works.
Let's say how it happened. It happened.
But also in terms of I don't need to speak too much. In terms of the airlines, I mean, one of the things is this. I mean, you're supporting the airlines to come into your destination. Let's say coming out of New York into the Caribbean, you have American Airlines that comes in. You're giving them market support. You have JetBlue that comes in. You're giving them market support. My personal, the way I see it, for me, that doesn't make any sense. Because it's your own money competing against your own money. I mean, my thing is, when we look at it as a first come, first served basis, that, JetBlue's coming in, great, give you market support, whatever we negotiated, whether it's guaranteed seats, whatever it is. If American wants to come in, I'm not going to stop them, but I'm not going to give you that market support.
You're talking on the same route.
On the same route, yeah.
That assumes that there's only enough traffic to fill one aircraft.
Exactly.
If I'm coming in, I'm going to base that assumption on the fact that I will stimulate demand by coming in. I'm not going to, it's not realistic for me to think I can take all of JetBlue's traffic and now I'll fly and they won't. But the idea is that you're going to expand your market size and that it's big enough for 2 carriers.
If you can carry that amount.
And that's where it's important to have your own analysis as well, so that you understand what the market potential is.
Right.
So that when that offer comes in, you can judge whether that's really realistic.
Including the stimulation, because you've got to account for that, because it's a proven number in a sense.
We mentioned,
I just also think that it's important for the airports to be strategic in which airlines they're going to talk to. Because not every airline is the right fit for a route. You might just think, I want somebody coming from New York to Barbados. There's so many airlines you can choose from. You have to be strategic. Which one do you think is the best fit for the country? Which one is going to be more successful based on their fleet, of course, what they can do, their marketing.
And I think countries have to make a very strategic decision before they bring in an LCC against a mainline carrier, because it's pretty well clear what their business model is and how they stimulate the demand.
Well, the one example I'll show you this afternoon, it's really interesting. I mean, I'm trying to remember what route it is, but this LCC comes in, and they added about 55% to the total market, of which 4% was taken from the mainline carrier. The rest was all new, but it's that super low-cost model where they're basically pulling new travelers rather than taking it from the guys. But it really depends on the market. Some markets, they're just going to steal it from the mainline.
you mentioned as one of the incentives of space coming out in off periods or whatever the case is. For the airlines, to keep up that, we'll always be off period on our side. Because basically they're going to focus on what is the busier airport that is going to, their availability, and you just have to fit in.
Yeah.
And what they can.
I don't think, actually, generally speaking, around the world, neither fees nor incentives have had much impact on moving traffic off peak. I mean, the airlines are restricted by so many parameters that, you know, they'll drive their schedule and route business. 5 minutes? We're good, thanks.
Lunch will be at 12:15, but you can
Okay.
continue.
No, I'm sure at 12:15, everybody here will leap up and I'll still be talking. Yeah. Yeah.
Earlier, I was down on the national airline, but we're one of the last ones to keep hold of our national airline, and they have been very instrumental at driving traffic, because they'll run a route just to get somebody interested, and they'll take all the licks and all the inefficiencies to stimulate business. And just recently it paid off. We were going up to New York, and now JetBlue's picked up the route that came from New York. So national air carriers can still be a beneficial tool for your economy. They're inefficient.
Even if they don't pay their fees and charges.
You look at it, you might put out $10 million in incentives, or you put out $10 million to keep your national carrier running. What is the benefit to the country?
To give some balance to Andrew's point, the national carrier needs to be part of the country's strategic vision for tourism.
Absolutely.
If they're running on their own, for example, in Andrew's case, in Cayman Islands case, it seems they're working in sync. In some other countries that a few of us are familiar with, there are national carriers that basically do the opposite. And they will hear about a route that someone else started and suddenly decide, that's good, let's get into it. So it comes back to the point that would be really about strategic planning, and they need to actually have them as part of the dialogue and understand what your role is, and that the role shouldn't be to drive away traffic. I thought you were going to say the drive away traffic.
No, but with them, with Cayman Islands, the DOT in Cayman is actually responsible for the marketing of Cayman Air. So, I mean, they have that relationship between each other. The DOT is actually responsible for their marketing.
Synergy.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. So,
Any other commentary? More questions? Where's Kevin? We need to talk about Kevin. It's a book.
You went out to lunch.
I'm just trying, give me a second. I need to check when we're supposed to get back together. So we're supposed to reconvene in an hour at 1:15. And as I said, there's only one session there. So we'll be finished, I think, by around 2:30, and then there's that plan for multiple buses. So thank you again.